A woman mocked Keanu Reeves for the way he was dressed, thinking she could humiliate him in front of a room full of strangers. Little did she know, she had no idea who he really was or what was about to unfold. What you're about to witness isn't just a dinner, it's a quiet moment of reckoning. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss a twist. The rain had only just begun to fall, gentle at first, not an intrusive downpour, but a soft mist that clung to the world. You weren't the type to stand out in a crowd, not a showy figure, no extravagant gestures, just a quiet, unassuming presence. In your gray hoodie, you looked like someone on his way to sip a solitary coffee, alone in thought. Maison Island was a place where such simplicity didn't fit. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a statement. A place where the distinction between the haves and the have-nots was etched in the very air, where people didn't simply walk in, they were escorted, announced, and expected. The glitter of crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over everything. Each marble tile gleamed like glass, polished to perfection. The atmosphere whispered of wealth, tradition, and a silent, judgmental gaze that watched everyone who entered. When you entered, Keanu, you pulled the hood back from your head, shaking off the light drizzle from your shoulders. A hostess in a sleek black suit looked up from the front desk, her smile faltering for just a brief moment as she sized you up. From the creased denim jeans to the faded sneakers that, while free from squeaks, certainly didn't shine. "Good evening," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, unsure if she was greeting a guest or simply addressing a lost tourist. "Do you have a reservation tonight?" Keanu smiled, effortlessly calm. "No reservation. Just hoping for a table." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She typed something into the computer with delicate fingers, glancing behind you, perhaps hoping someone more suitably dressed would walk through the door. "Well, most of our dining area is reserved tonight," she said, her voice hesitant. "But we do have a table by the window." "That'll be perfect," you replied. The hostess paused, then grabbed a menu and led you toward your seat. She moved just a little too quickly, almost eager to be done with the task, as if you were a small inconvenience to her carefully curated world. Her fingers gripped the edges of the menu like a lifeline, but you noticed her hesitance, the brief flicker of judgment as her eyes trailed over your appearance. The clink of silverware, the hushed murmurs from the patrons, and the soft thrum of ambient music only seemed to deepen the contrast between your understated self and their polished world. The other patrons, dressed in designer suits, barely glanced up, but their eyes followed you with barely concealed curiosity. Their glances, though momentary, lingered like they were trying to decode something they couldn't quite place. A puzzle that had no answer, a presence that didn't quite match the image they had expected. The corners of their vision tracked your every step, trying to assess if you were out of place or merely passing through. The table you were escorted to was small and unadorned, a solitary piece of furniture amidst the surrounding elegance. It was close enough to the door for a cold draft to brush against your skin, but far enough from the main dining area to make you feel excluded. The discomfort was there, but it was subtle, the kind that didn't demand attention. Just an undercurrent, a reminder that you didn't belong in their world. But you didn't mind. You took your seat with the calm of someone who had long since learned to ignore such things. You thanked the hostess with a kind of courtesy that was just enough to satisfy her, though you could tell that she didn't expect it. Your eyes ran over the menu as if you'd never seen one before in your life, taking in the flowery descriptions of dishes you had no intention of ordering. You weren't here for the food, after all. A young server approached, her smile polite but cautious. She moved like she was walking on a tightrope, unsure of how to treat a guest who defied the rules of the restaurant without having to say a word. You ordered a simple meal, a plate of grilled sourdough with soft-boiled eggs and a side of fruit, the kind of order that didn't belong among $22 martinis and dry-aged steaks. It was too plain, too basic, and definitely out of place among the extravagant dishes dotting the tables around you. The server hesitated before writing it down, perhaps trying to reconcile the simplicity of your request with the elegance of the surroundings. Leaning back, you folded your hands on the table, observing the room. You didn't need to glance at the other patrons to know they were watching you. Curiosity was a powerful thing. No one recognized you yet, and that was exactly how you wanted it. There was something liberating about being mistaken for less, about blending in so well that no one thought to ask questions. Tonight wasn't about being seen, it was about watching, and you were very good at that. With every fleeting glance, every soft chuckle, every quick glance of disapproval, you were learning about these people. People who seemed to think their wealth and status were something worth holding on to, something to flaunt. And yet, in this silence, you were the observer. The quiet observer who could see through the cracks of their carefully constructed facades. It was a power they could never understand. Claudia Marlowe arrived like she always did, with the effortless authority of someone who knew the room belonged to her the moment she entered. The doors of Maison Island parted as if pushed open by invisible hands, the rain never touching her. As she stepped into the restaurant, it was as if the atmosphere itself shifted to make space for her. Her arrival was a spectacle, though it happened without the overt drama one might expect from someone so accustomed to being noticed. She had a driver, of course, but he parked just far enough away to remain unseen, his car never quite pulling into the spotlight. A personal umbrella carrier, a silent shadow, appeared for mere seconds to shield her from the rain, only to disappear the moment her feet touched the dry ground. She was always in control, always one step ahead of the world, and she didn't need anyone to remind her of it. Her heels clicked on the polished marble floor with the kind of rhythmic precision that announced her before she even spoke. The sound was sharp and confident, each step a reminder of her place in this world, a world where wealth and power had their own rhythm. As she moved through the space, all eyes were inevitably drawn to her, not by force, but because she had mastered the art of subtlety. She didn't demand attention, she simply commanded it. Claudia Marlowe wore a beige trench coat that, though simple in design, cost more than most people's rent. It billowed just slightly as she walked, each movement exuding an aura of effortless luxury. A sleek Chanel bag swung casually from her wrist, the leather pristine, the gold clasp gleaming like a beacon of status. Her lipstick was the color of cold, deep red, the kind worn by women who knew how to be obeyed, who wore authority like a second skin. Claudia Marlowe, she announced, not as an introduction but as a declaration. Her voice was smooth and clear, each word perfectly timed to ensure it resonated throughout the room, whether the people around her were ready to listen or not. It was a name people recognized, a name that carried weight even in the quietest moments. The hostess responded immediately, her tone shifting to one of practiced politeness, the kind that came only after years of navigating the intricate dance of power and status. She stood straighter, almost bowing as she led Claudia to her usual table, the one reserved for her alone. There was no need for words to be exchanged. The hostess had already memorized Claudia's preferences, down to the smallest detail. "Table 7, as always," the hostess said, almost reverentially. Claudia's thin smile barely registered as she walked ahead, her gaze never straying from the path she knew well. She was already confident of her place, her every movement calculated to reinforce that sense of control. Her destination was always the same, a slightly elevated table near the wine wall. The position was perfect, offering the best lighting for photos she never admitted were staged but which everyone knew were part of her brand. The table, positioned just right, let Claudia bask in the glow of her own cultivated image, making sure everyone in the room could see her, admire her, without ever needing to say a word. But today, something was different. As Claudia Marlowe walked across the floor, her eyes, trained to capture every detail, fell on something that didn't quite belong, a man seated by the window, 2 tables away from hers. He was alone, completely absorbed in the menu as if he didn't realize the setting he was in. The sight stopped her, just for a moment, and for a fraction of a second, her flawless smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed, a slight tension in her jaw that was only visible to those who had learned to read her. Claudia was not used to being startled, but something about this man caught her attention in a way no one had for a long time. He seemed utterly unremarkable, yet in a place like this, his very presence felt out of place. He didn't fit the script. She had an innate ability to spot those who were in the wrong crowd, and this man was one of them. She turned to the hostess, her gaze still fixed on you with barely restrained distaste. Her voice was low, yet sharp enough for those nearby to catch her words, slicing through the ambient chatter of the room. "Who seated that?" she asked, her chin tilting in your direction, a subtle yet unmistakable gesture full of disdain. The hostess, visibly uncomfortable under Claudia's scrutinizing gaze, hesitated for a second. "He came in earlier and just walked in." Her tone was unsure, as if unsure whether she had done something wrong. Claudia's face tightened, her expression hardening with each passing moment. Claudia's brows arched upward in a moment of disbelief, before they dropped back down in a controlled flicker of disdain. "And you sat him there?" The question wasn't a request for information. It was an accusation, one that carried more weight than any question could. It was clear that this wasn't a matter of curiosity. This was a power play, a subtle way of establishing dominance. The hostess froze, trying to assess the situation quickly, her mind racing to find the right response. "He asked for a table. That was what was available," she offered, hoping it would be enough. Claudia blinked slowly, her gaze sharpening even further. She said nothing more to the hostess, but simply turned her back, making her way to her table with a deliberate, measured pace. As she walked away, she exhaled sharply through her nose, a barely audible sound that betrayed her growing irritation. Her silence was her message, a clear indication that something about the situation had offended her deeply, and she wouldn't let it go unnoticed. Claudia was used to orchestrating the environment around her, and it was clear that your presence, in her mind, had upset the delicate balance she so carefully maintained. There was no room for imperfection in her world, and you, unseen, unnoticed, just existing, had somehow disrupted it. When Claudia's server arrived with the first of her orders, Claudia was already poised, her coat adjusted just so, her eyes never leaving you. There was a stillness about her, like a predator circling its prey, measuring every movement before making it strike. She didn't need to ask for attention. She already had it, and she knew it. Her posture, her expression, the way she held herself, it was all a display of control, as though the world around her existed only for her convenience. "I'll have my usual," she said, her voice smooth and steady, not even glancing at the menu. Her words were a command, not a request, and the server responded immediately, accustomed to Claudia's frequent visits. Then, after a slight pause, as if considering the small inconvenience that had been bothering her for the past few minutes, Claudia added, almost lazily, "And could you do something about that table by the window? I come here for peace." The server glanced over toward you, uncertain of what Claudia was asking. Her eyes flickered between Claudia and you, trying to gauge the best way to handle the request. "He's just dining, ma'am," she replied hesitantly. It wasn't an accusation, it was merely an observation, a factual statement meant to clarify that you were doing nothing wrong. Claudia's lips curled, but not into a smile. It was colder, more calculating, a faint expression of amusement that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice lower now, as if speaking to herself. "And so am I." The words weren't an answer, they were a statement of ownership, a reminder that she, too, was entitled to peace, and her peace had been disturbed. Her voice didn't need to be raised to be heard. That was Claudia's power. She understood the art of control, the way every word, every syllable, could be crafted to maintain authority without ever seeming to raise her voice. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, designed to leave an imprint on the listener. As she spoke, she sipped her wine slowly, her eyes flicking back toward you again, analyzing you from her place at the table. You hadn't even noticed her at first, but now, Claudia watched you intently, her gaze unwavering. You were still reading quietly, your elbows tucked in, making no fuss. You were the embodiment of indifference, of calm, and that was what bothered her the most. Your very presence, your effortless blending into the space, seemed to mock her careful control. You didn't belong here, not in her world. And yet, you seemed unfazed by it, as if this place, this room, held no power over you at all. That was the worst part. You didn't care. And Claudia, for all her wealth and control, could not let that go. The thought lingered in her mind, gnawing at her as she watched you, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how you could remain so composed in a world where she had to fight for every moment of attention. Leaning back in her chair with effortless grace, Claudia Marlowe took a slow sip from her glass, her eyes never straying far from the man seated by the window. She could almost feel the pulse of the room as it shifted in response to her presence. The quiet murmur of conversations, the clink of silverware, the soft hum of distant chatter, all of it seemed to bend toward her. At that moment, her dining companion, a junior editor from a well-known glossy magazine, was doing his best to stay in her good graces. It was clear he had an agenda, he wanted favor, and he was hoping that flattering her would get him exactly what he needed. Claudia didn't give him much attention. not at first. Instead, she allowed a moment of silence to fill the space between them before she spoke. Her voice rich with irony, a carefully chosen weapon. "Isn't it fascinating?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. "How some places just let anyone in these days." The editor chuckled nervously, unsure whether it was a rhetorical question or an invitation to agree. But Claudia didn't wait for his response. She was already continuing, her words laced with venom and a quiet amusement. "I remember when this restaurant had a dress code." Her voice had a deliberate sweetness to it, but the bitterness was unmistakable. She raised her glass slightly in your direction, but it was a gesture that barely acknowledged you. An invisible barb shot your way, as if your mere presence had somehow offended her. "Now we've got hoodies and, what's that? Target sneakers." Her companion, clearly uncomfortable now, shifted in his seat, his eyes darting nervously between Claudia and you, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. But Claudia didn't pause. Her words were delivered with an almost unbearable casualness, a soft mocking undertone present in each syllable. "I'm all for diversity, of style, opinion, even background," she said, but her tone was anything but inclusive. It was condescending, as if she were granting a small allowance for people who did not belong in her world. But standards still matter. Her voice softened further, almost imperceptibly, like the gentle caress of a blade just before it struck. Her words, meant to be overheard, carried an unmistakable edge. They were an invitation to listen, an invitation to judge. And of course, you heard her. You always did. The words were like needles, sharp and pointed, but you didn't react. You turned the page of your book as if nothing had been said. As if the entire world around you, the subtle cruelty dripping from Claudia's voice, didn't exist. Your calmness, your refusal to engage, was exactly what enraged her. The silence between you was louder than any confrontation. Your indifference stung her in a way she couldn't control, and it was far worse than any argument could have been. In her mind, you were supposed to feel embarrassed, or, at the very least, take notice. But you didn't. You simply continued with your quiet existence, making her feel like the outsider, not you. Claudia's lips parted in a smile, but it was thin and cold, a sign of her growing frustration. She wasn't used to being ignored. People like her were accustomed to drawing attention, to being noticed, to commanding the space they occupied. Yet here you were, seated by the window, reading your book, entirely oblivious to her verbal jabs, completely indifferent to her attempts at control. The realization stung more than she cared to admit. She leaned forward, her voice rising just enough to ensure that everyone within earshot would hear her next words. "You know," she said, drawing out the syllables as if she were lecturing, "when you dine somewhere like Maison Island, you expect a certain consistency, a standard." The words rolled off her tongue with the precision of a practiced performer, her gaze sweeping across the room as if she were addressing an unseen audience. "That's why people like us come here. People like us." The room seemed to pause, as though the weight of her words hung in the air, an invisible barrier separating those who belonged from those who didn't. The emphasis on "people like us" was deliberate, a reminder of the invisible line she thought she was on the right side of. She didn't need to say more, everyone within earshot understood what she meant. Her declaration was a subtle mark of her power, a way of reinforcing the hierarchy that she thought she owned. When her starter arrived, a dish of grilled octopus on black garlic puree, Claudia barely glanced at it. She had already lost interest in the food. Her focus was now fully on you, the person who, in her eyes, had disturbed the perfect balance of her evening. The server, hovering nearby, caught her attention again, and Claudia raised a hand, her fingers flicking lightly to signal the request. "Could you kindly ask that gentleman by the window to lower his voice?" Claudia said, her tone polite yet firm, the words carrying an authority that left no room for disagreement. The server blinked in confusion, her brow furrowing slightly as she processed the request. "I don't think he said anything, ma'am," she replied, her voice soft and uncertain. Claudia's lips twisted into a thin, barely there smile, one that didn't touch her eyes. "Oh no," she said, her voice rising slightly, loud enough for the nearby table to overhear. "Perhaps it's just his presence that's loud." Her words hung in the air, a clear attempt to belittle you, to draw attention to your existence in the most demeaning way possible. The murmurs from nearby tables rippled through the room, and you could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the room seemed to lean in toward her, just waiting for the spectacle to unfold. You, however, remained calm. You looked up from your book, not at Claudia, but toward the ceiling. A deep breath. Then you returned to your page, the soft rustle of paper louder than her last 3 sentences combined. Your composure, your complete refusal to engage, was a direct challenge to everything Claudia stood for. It enraged her, and yet she couldn't make you react. You were unfazed, invisible to her power plays, and that, perhaps, was the most irritating thing of all. Claudia's voice snapped through the air, sharp and too quick, as if she were trying to keep herself from unraveling in the midst of the growing tension. But as she turned toward Keanu, her words caught in her throat. His eyes were already cast away from her, the unreadable calm of his expression making her feel small. His book, once open, now lay closed in his lap, the pages silent and untouched. Across the room, the sound of someone stirring a drink louder than necessary broke through the quiet, like a distant ripple in an otherwise still pond. A woman at a nearby table cleared her throat, the sound echoing like a subtle rebuke, pointed but gentle. It was as if the room itself was responding to her discomfort, subtly turning its attention toward her, as if waiting for her to react. Claudia tried to steady herself, her breath coming in slow, deliberate inhales, but the burn rising in her chest was harder to ignore than she'd anticipated. Something in the air had changed, but it wasn't just the shift in temperature. No, it was something deeper, something more personal. It was her own unraveling. She could feel it in the tension that coiled her fingers, the tightness creeping along her jawline, the thumping pulse at her temples. There was an energy building in the room now, a weight that she hadn't expected. Her usual poise, her polished control, was slipping, and in its place was an unsettling feeling that she couldn't shake. She couldn't figure out what had caused it. Keanu's one comment, the one sentence that had passed his lips, had struck her like a solid weight, dropping into the delicate glass room of her carefully curated existence. And now, the silence around her wasn't just a calm pause in the evening. It felt thick with judgment, as though the very air was aware of her discomfort, of the way she was trying, and failing, to maintain her composure. She turned her gaze back to Keanu, the calm man at the window. He hadn't reacted to her. He wasn't smiling, nor was he glaring. He was simply present. His eyes weren't on her, but that wasn't what bothered her. It was the fact that he hadn't been fazed by her presence at all. He seemed so comfortably indifferent, his energy almost a quiet challenge to her. That peaceful stillness, that lack of concern, felt like a burn in her chest. It was a silent confrontation, one that didn't require any words, yet it hit her harder than anything else could. The coolness of his indifference, the way he continued with his book, was enough to make her feel like the outsider, the one trying too hard to fit into a world that no longer acknowledged her. It was the most humiliating experience she'd had in a long time, and she hated it. Claudia's breath came in slow, controlled inhales, the kind she'd mastered over the years to maintain an image of calm even when she felt anything but. She held her breath for a moment before exhaling sharply, expelling the tension that had begun to coil tightly in her chest. She wouldn't give in to it. She wouldn't let this man, Keanu, get under her skin. She wouldn't let herself feel embarrassed, not by him, not by anyone. No one made Claudia Marlowe feel small. With a slight flick of her fingers, she adjusted her scarf, the movement as precise as it was deliberate, and straightened her shoulders, like a queen subtly resetting her crown. This was her space, her domain, and she would not let it be taken from her. With a practiced flick, she reached for the silver call button above her chair. The soft chime that followed was delicate, almost musical, but in the thickened silence of the room, it rang out louder than usual. It felt less like a polite request and more like a warning bell, a signal to the room that something was amiss. The low murmur of conversation around her seemed to quiet in response, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next act to unfold. Moments later, her server arrived, flanked by the floor manager. Their smiles were tight, their faces polite, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. It was as if they too sensed that something had shifted, and they were unsure how to handle it. The floor manager's smile didn't reach his eyes, and he regarded Claudia with an air of carefully measured neutrality. "Yes, ma'am?" the manager asked, his tone careful, almost as though he were bracing himself for a reprimand. Claudia, her expression composed, leaned forward just slightly, allowing her cold gaze to fix on the manager. Her voice, when it came, lacked the silky smoothness it usually carried. There was an edge to it now, a sharpness that betrayed the calm exterior she was trying so hard to maintain. "I'd like to speak with someone with real authority," she said, her words slow, measured. She wasn't angry, not yet, but there was no mistaking the challenge in her tone. The manager blinked, his surprise briefly breaking his composed exterior. "I'm the manager on duty," he said, a touch of confusion creeping into his voice. Claudia's smile tightened, becoming a thin, icy line. "Then perhaps someone above your pay grade." Her voice was like ice, smooth, but with an unmistakable cutting quality. She leaned in closer, every word deliberate, each syllable dripping with controlled civility. "There's clearly been a lapse in standards tonight." Her hand waved subtly toward Keanu, the gesture elegant yet dismissive. "That man over there has created an environment that's made this evening unpleasant. He stared at me, made veiled comments, and frankly, his presence is making several patrons uneasy." The accusation was out there now, hanging in the air, as if it had been waiting for her to say it. The tension in the room thickened, and Claudia could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her. They were listening. They were watching. And this time, they weren't on her side. She could see the uncertainty in the manager's eyes as he processed her words. They didn't believe her, not fully, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and Claudia knew that once it was in the air, it would spread. Claudia's words were calculated, her voice smooth and unwavering, a string of lies so expertly woven that it was hard to distinguish fact from fiction. Each sentence was crafted to serve her narrative, her tone demanding agreement from the world around her as if it were an undeniable truth. There was no hesitation in her delivery. She spoke with the certainty of someone who had done this countless times before, manipulating the world to fit her desires. But despite the practiced ease with which she spun her tale, there was a faint undercurrent of desperation in her voice, a subtle tremor she fought to suppress. The manager, still clearly disoriented by her demands, hesitated. His confusion was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might refute her entirely. "I'm sorry," he said softly, looking at Claudia with a faint air of uncertainty. "I don't believe Claudia's patience, which had already worn thin, snapped. She cut him off before he could finish, her voice biting and cold. "This is a fine dining establishment, or it's a bus station with candles." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The finality in her statement left no room for debate, no space for questioning her judgment. She was the authority now, and she would make sure everyone in the room knew it. That was the moment the surrounding tables could no longer pretend to ignore the tension. The air had grown thick with discomfort, and the once polite hum of conversation had come to a halt. The sound of a phone subtly shifted across the aisle, the quiet click of a camera capturing the unfolding scene. It was a subtle move, but it didn't escape the notice of anyone paying attention. Claudia didn't notice, though. She was too caught up in the process of regaining control, of making sure that the narrative she had constructed, one where she was the aggrieved party, the one in control, was the one that would dominate the evening. The manager, clearly uncomfortable with the situation and not wishing to escalate it further, nodded slowly, his face tight with unease. "I'll speak with our executive team, ma'am," he said, the words coming out almost mechanically, as though he had been trained to say them in these moments. Claudia leaned back in her chair, a sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had done it. She had bent the situation to her will, and now, the next step was inevitable. The next person to arrive would be the one to remove Keanu, to make him leave the restaurant, to reaffirm her position at the top of the social hierarchy. She was certain of it, convinced that her actions would bring the swift resolution she desired. But what she couldn't know, what she couldn't predict, was that the next person to walk through the door wouldn't be there to remove him at all. Instead, they would be there to recognize him, and that small act would upend everything she had built her life upon. For the first time, the room wouldn't bend to her will. It would bend to his. Do you think Keanu handled the situation the right way? Drop your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you stand for kindness and quiet strength, hit that like or comment, respect, so we know you're with us. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because in our next stories, justice doesn't shout, it simply shows.